Chapter 8 Double Vision. The double monocle gave her a headache. Cass wasn't sure what she'd expected. To see all those ghosts the seer was talking about, but all she was the dizzying experience of seeing double through a single eye. Holding the monocle tight, she turned in a circle, surveying the world around her. As one object exited her vision, another took its place. The first object, a pitchfork, a donkey, a bale of hay, seemed to leave an after-image, like when you wave your hand through the air and it appears to leave the trail in its wake. A curious effect, but hardly paranormal. This is just double vision, she thought, not second sight. But when she put down the monocle, she noticed something rather surprising. Some of the things she'd been looking at were much farther away than they appeared. Through the monocle, to the naked eye, they were mere specks in the distance. She looked into the monocle again, and confirmed that yes, it functioned as an exceptionally powerful pair of binoculars. As she moved the monocle away from her eye, then back again, she noticed something else. Some things she was seeing through the monocle weren't visible at all otherwise. They were blocked by walls, by animals, by people. With the monocle, she could see almost everything around her, no matter how far away or how covered up. Maybe not as exciting as seeing spirits, but to Cass thrilling nonetheless, and more useful. Certainly, it would make finding someone much easier. She turned to the direction in which she last seen the jester. The crowd had not fully disappeared. With the monocle, she could see through the things of people at the market, and yet she still could not see him. The box he'd been standing on is bare. A quick glance around through the monocle was sufficient to confirm the bad news. He was gone. Despair threatened to overtake her, but she stifled it with an act of will. She had been in plenty of situations more difficult than this, she reminded herself. Of course, in most of those situations, Max Ernest had been with her. More often than not, she complained that he was just getting in the way. But now that he wasn't by her side, she suddenly felt helpless. She depended on his logical mind to solve the puzzles and crack the codes. If he were here with her, what would he say that would help her find the jester? Well, what do we know about the jester? She imagined Max Ernest asking. Difficultly, she started making a list in her head. The jester was the founder of the Trace Society. He likes to rhyme and tell jokes. He wore a silly hat with bells. He worked for the king, if you would call being a jester work. He had pointy ears like hers, and he was her great, she wasn't certain how many greats, grandfather. He lived in a tent. He knew the secret. Most of the things Cass knew from talking to her friend. The late great homunculus Mr. Cabbageface, being 500 years old, he'd known that jester personally. He also was the only 2 feet tall, or nearly, and born in a bottle. But that's another story. A story told in the Legend of Cabbageface. If you have not read The Legend of Cabbageface, you can find it in my second book. If you're reading this, it's too late. One word of caution. As Mr. Wallace, the Trace Society archivist, pointed out in that book, The Legend of Cabbageface was written by someone with a literary aspiration. That's to say, he might have taken literary license, embellishing facts, and perhaps even making up things altogether. You should read it with a grain of salt. In other words, as you should any short story or novel excepting this one. On the list, number 4, he worked for the king, and number 6, he lived in a tent. Seemed to be the only items of information that might help at this moment. The king, Cass assumed, lived not in a tent, but in a place or a castle. What was the difference, anyways? The difference, as Max Ernest would have told her, is that a palace is a luxury residence designed to comfort royalty and to impress visitors. A castle is a fortress structure built to withstand enemy attacks. This palace or castle, Cass could hear Max Ernest say, would be the logical first place to look for the jester. If the jester wasn't there, she might find him in his tent nearby. So the question was, where was the palace? She dropped the words or castle for the sake of brevity, because Max Ernest wasn't really listening to her thoughts. Not that she was aware of, anyways. Being invisible, she couldn't very well ask for directions. There were no signs, unfortunately. The market might have looked like a Renaissance fair, but there were no helpful markers or struck to the ground with arrows pointing one way to the king's palace, the other way to the ye old pizza stand. Which way had she come from? That would be a place to start. Since she hadn't been seen a palace on her way into the town, maybe she would try the opposite direction. Before she could start retracing her steps, a trumpet sounded. Make way, the Duke is on parade, and he brings gifts from the king. All at once the crowd of people in the market divided in two. Some grumbled in annoyance, others chattered with excitement. But everyone stepped aside as if there were no options but to obey. A moment later, a long procession started passing through. Cass surveyed the participants through the double monocle. First came a series of soldiers on foot, footmen, she presumed, unless the other word had more specific meaning. They held curving swords and wore puffy pants, knickers, Cass wanted to call them, and they ended at the knee. Then there were the knights on horseback. They were in full armor and gleamed in the sun. Long swords and longer javelins hung at their sides, ready and waiting for the next joust. "Whoa, boy, tally-ho!" they shouted to their horses. Also on horseback were several finely dressed men and women who were simply to be called lords and ladies in the Renaissance fair, but who, in actuality, Cass figured, had more specific names and titles. They did not call out to the crowd, but rather chattered and gossiping among themselves, teasing one another and cooing themselves with fans, and strife-ruffled collars moving only slightly in the breeze. Who were they? The Duke's family? Princess and princesses? Watching them pass by was like looking into a history book without being able to read the text. The images meant nothing without captions explaining them. In the middle of the procession was a large wooden chest studded with brass in all sides and held aloof by 4 muscle-bound soldiers. They grunted with effort and counted rhythmically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, to synchronize their steps. Around Cass, peasants grumbled at the sight of the chest. "Gifts for the king," he says. "More like duty for the king." "'Tis not a gift if you demand it." "Ah, don't shed a tear for the Duke. He can't afford it." "Course he can't. He takes all our profits." "I wonder what's inside the chest," Cass thought, edging closer to the procession. She examined the chest through the monocle. There was something about the lock It was large and ornate and resembled a coat of arms. She told her more than simply money laid inside. In any case, the chest was held for the king, so she would follow it to the palace, and with any luck to the jester. Her invisibility gave her great freedom of movement, and she was about to fall into place behind the last footman when a funny thing happened in front of her. A head of a man's head, to be precise, peeked out of a barrel of onions and sat seemingly abandoned at the edge of the market, surprised and momentarily overwhelmed by the scent of onions. Cass exhaled loudly. The man wheeled around and looked straight in her direction. He was wearing a black mask over the top half of his face, while the bottom half was covered by something rather angrily looking whiskers. He held a large axe in his hand, were it not for the sticks of hay, assorted onion stinking around her hairs. He would have looked very sinister. Cass tried not to flinch, remembering herself he could not see her. Frowning, the masked man turned back and quietly stepped out of the barrel. He gestured silently to his right, and Cass saw another man step out of a sack of potatoes. Still another man stepped out from behind the apple cart. Afraid of making noise, Cass watched, transfixed. It was clear that these three men were about to embark on some kind of idiocy, probably criminal activity. But what activity in particular, she had no idea. Suddenly the sound of galloping horses drowned out all the other noise in the market. Looking over her shoulder, Cass saw another market figure thundering towards her with a tall black steed. The horse's neck was bent low, and his long black mane flying in the wind. Marching the horse's posture, the rider was also bent forward, long dark hair flying. Around them, carts overturned, cages sprung open, people scattered. But horses and rider seemed to occupy their own universe, so fast-moving that, in comparison, the rest of the market seemed to exit in slow motion. And yet, with her monocle, Cass could see every inch of the horse and rider, as if time had stopped altogether. The horse came closer, a living cyclone of clustered hoofs, flaring nostrils, and gleaming muscles. For a brief second, Cass caught a glimpse of the masked rider. It was a woman, a beautiful woman, her lips pursed in concentration. Anastasia, Anastasia, the name ripped through the crowd, repeatedly like an incarnation. The moment later, the horse was hurtling towards the procession. It all happened so fast. Nobody seemed to know where to turn. There were screams and shouts and commotion. Soldiers waving swords, horses spinning in circles, ladies and even a lord or two fainting in fright. Within seconds, a big wooden chest was on the ground, bewhisked, and bandits and a few onion skins still stuck in his hairs dropped the heavy axe down on the lid of the chest, breaking the big brass lock. The soldiers who had been carrying the chest watched helplessly, their hands tied behind their backs. Quickly and dutifully, the masked woman, Anastasia, tossed the ruby ring, an embedded necklace, silver goblets, and golden candlesticks, each of the masked cohorts in turn. Now, on horseback themselves, they caught the glittering booty with outstretched hands, and urged their horses away from the market in the direction of the neighboring woods. "What's this?" Her axe-wielding companion opened a small wooden box. It held up a jagged black rock. The rock was about the size of a capilot and had thin veins of gold running through it. "It is ugly, but must be very valuable," said Anastasia, ripping open the very bag and finding it full of golden coins. Otherwise the Duke would not dare send it to the king. As she spoke, the coins started to fly out of the bag and landing on the mysterious rock. Reins and spurs and chains. Every bit of metal in the vacancy seemed to be drawn into it. Soon the rock was covered with small mountains of metal. Cass watched from the crowd through the lens of the double monocle. The rock had a unique blush glow. It seemed almost to pulsate. Was she imagining it, or could she feel the monocle being tugged in the rock's direction? Anastasia stared at the rock. "I have never seen the like." Experimentally, the bandit colleagues brushed away the coins, making a clear patch. She brought the axe closer to the rock and struck the rock with a clang. "The power," he said, pulling them apart. It is a stone of a sorcerer. Do you think it is cursed?" "Nonsense. There is a much simpler explanation, I am sure," said Anastasia. "Put it away, Thomas. There will be time to play later. Take the chest with you. It's nearly empty now." Eyeing the rock with more of a hint of nervousness, the masked man Thomas carefully placed it inside his rucksack. Then he strapped a big wooden chest to the back of the nearest horse, jumped on, and galloped away. Meanwhile, Anastasia had raised another bag of coins above her head, and now was giving back to the people what was theirs. She swung the bag around with a flourish, raining gold coins and cheering to the crowd. "Anastasia! Hooray, Anastasia!" they chanted. Her horse reared, tossing its thick black mane in the air, so that it was backed by the sun. She brought the horse down onto 4 legs. The mysterious generosity thief tossed her own black mane in a similar fashion. She too galloped away, following the bandit comrades into the woods. Cass watched wistfully through the double monocle. She felt an unexpected yearning to follow after the daring woman and her bandit of thieves, but her job lay elsewhere. With a sigh, she lowered the monocle. She turned towards the processions, or what remained of the procession, after the robbers had done their work. The parade, perhaps, to follow to the palace.